Hi everyone, my name is Barkha Dutt and you're watching The Mojo Story, our independent digital platform that does a deep dive into the top stories of the day. On the program today, we're looking ahead at what is going to be the world's largest vaccine rollout, kicking off officially this weekend, but still amidst all manners of question. This as the government clarifies that people will not necessarily be given a choice between Covishield and Covaxin, the two approved vaccines in India, one made by the Serum Institute and the other by Bharat Biotech. But the nature of approvals to both is in fact quite different. The Covaxin approval, which is, of course, the vaccine being manufactured by Bharat Biotech, is still in trial mode. In other words, it means that you will actually need to sign a consent form if you are actually being given Covaxin, the Bharat Biotech vaccine. There are also questions about whether vaccines should indeed be free for all or whether those who can pay for them should be asked to pay for them. Even among worries that the wealthiest Indians may actually find their way outside the shores of India as flights open and may pay for other vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, as an unspoken hierarchy of vaccines emerges in at least drawing rooms of the rich and famous. So many questions as the vaccine begins to roll out from the 16th. And joining us now to walk us through some of these issues is Dr. Srinath Reddy, one of our best known public health experts. Welcome to the show, sir. It's a pleasure having you with us. Let me start by actually asking you to look ahead a little bit. Of course, India has, the good news is that India has mass experience with immunization programs. And so as a country, we know how to do this. We also produce 60% of the world's vaccines, so we know how to do that as well. But there has been the health ministry making this point that people will not necessarily be given an option between the two approved vaccines, even though the nature of approvals to both is quite different. Does that actually concern you?
Well, it certainly is a matter of concern, but people ought to have the right of refusal, certainly, or at least say that they do not wish to take a vaccine, they do not have confidence in, or have concerns about, and then wait for the next round of the other vaccine or even newer vaccines that may come later on. I don't think it can be a coercive procedure, but nevertheless, if the choice is given at this point in time, I'm sure people will exercise choice. But I think the supply side logistics do not permit that kind of a choice to be exercised at the moment. So the alternative is to let them accept it or not accept it and wait for a later opportunity to get the vaccine that may be more acceptable to them.
But Dr. Reddy, the nature of approvals to both Covaxin and Covishield are in fact not the same. The Serum Institute vaccine is in fact fully approved for use and does not require, let's say, you and me who may be in line to get the vaccine to sign a consent form, nor will we be traced for our recovery or other follow-ups. But a Bharat Biotech vaccine, if somebody were to administer it to me, would need me to, in fact, sign on the dotted line. So when you say people should be given the right to refusal, what do you actually mean by that? Because vaccines are not mandatory. Nobody can force us to actually sign up and get the vaccine. But the question is, should we be allowed to exercise choice as to which vaccine between these two we want, given that the nature of approvals to both are different?
Well, given the fact that the logistics of supply to different centers cannot really have a mixed vaccine supply, I think, therefore, that kind of individual choice at each vaccination center at this point in time might become difficult. But the point you're raising is whether the two vaccines are really comparable in terms of efficacy and whether that should actually influence the people's choice.
Yeah.
Well, let me try and give you the two perspectives which are possibly differing. First, safety is not the issue here because I think in terms of safety, both have proven safety. It is the
Right.
question of efficacy.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the Covishield is concerned, again, the efficacy is riding on the UK data, not so much on the Indian data. The Indian trial is still a very small trial, but it is the UK data which has been reviewed by the regulator there, which has really led the permission being granted to Covishield. There too, the efficacy rates have differed between various doses of administration, but nevertheless, all forms of administration, whether they were half dose, full dose, or two full doses, or 28 days apart or 3 months apart, all of them have crossed the 50% barrier. So efficacy is fairly well assured.
Yeah.
However, as far as the Bharat Biotech is concerned, certainly the phase 3 trial has not been completed, though they say it will be completed by March. But then there are different perspectives. Let me try and present you both the perspectives, and then we can debate
Sure.
about it.
Sure.
The perspective, of course, in purely in terms of science, is that yes, a phase 3 trial must be completed,
Yeah.
and we must look at the efficacy results of the phase 3 trial. Now, in terms of the perspective from the health system administrators is that they are now having a shortage of vaccines. They will not be able to deal with the large-scale mass immunization if they depend only on the supply from AstraZeneca, which is going to be partly to India, partly to the international market, and partly to the private market, even in India. And the second element is, of course, the government has said that since the mutants have now started appearing, particularly the British mutant B117, there is the risk, to some extent, not yet proven, that a vaccine which is directed only against the spike protein
Yeah.
may sometimes become ineffective if the mutations are substantial in the spike protein, whereas the inactivated virus has other antigens to present, and therefore the more broad-based immunity and the virus, even with the mutations in the spike protein, will not be able to evade the immunity produced by the vaccine.
So
Then there is
can I interject there? Because actually the inactivated virus vaccine is the Bharat Biotech vaccine, which ironically right now most Indians believe has less efficacy than the Serum Institute one. But you're actually saying that when you talk about mutant strains, the Bharat Biotech vaccine could prove to be the hardier vaccine because it's based on the inactivated virus approach. Am I understanding you correctly?
you're absolutely right, but it's still a theoretical consideration
Yeah.
because the vaccines that are either in the mRNA vaccines or even the AstraZeneca vaccine are directed only at the spike protein, which is the key element of the virus with which it opens the door to the cell. But should the mutations in the spike protein be so substantial that the immunity directed against the spike protein does not affect the vaccine, affect the virus, and the virus evades the immune response, then there could be problems. On the other hand, an inactivated virus, which is a whole virion, has other antigens as well. And if you actually develop antibodies against three of those antigens, including the spike protein, even if the spike protein becomes difficult to access because of the mutations, the other two antibodies and the immunity against the other two antigens will succeed. That is the theoretical consideration. Right now, there is no concern that even the AstraZeneca vaccine is ineffective against the current mutations, but in a
Yeah.
sense, taking a bit of a guarantee, you're taking a bit of insurance against the possible further mutations in the spike protein.
But let's just come out to the rollout and what this means. You're saying that the options, given the timelines, don't actually exist, and people should be allowed to say no. I don't want this. I'll wait for this in terms of choosing between the two vaccines, right? But I think most people don't even know, and that this is the concern that, for example, poorer people who are not educated, they may not actually know that they're supposed to fill in a form. They may not know what that consent form actually means. So, there have been all sort of ethicists that have raised questions about this. What would you say is the best way for the government to handle these ethical concerns?
Well, I think there must be full and adequate disclosure in the best possible manner. Of course, in the first round, you're giving it to health workers, and health workers hopefully should be able to understand what the vaccine is about if properly explained.
But health workers will also have to sign that consent form if they take the Bharat Biotech vaccine at this point, right?
Yes, because at the moment they're also saying that it's going to continue in a sort of a trial mode. Therefore, the
That's
consent
right.
forms have to be given.
That's
But
right.
the information related to the vaccine would have to be provided, and to anybody who takes it. And therefore, in terms of the next round, up after the health workers are the other essential workers, and again, I think all possible information must be provided to people who are getting the vaccine. There's no doubt about that. In terms of the understanding, the health workers are probably going to be better placed than the general public, but everybody who is getting the vaccine is entitled to the information.
What should the government do? Should the government be administering more of Covishield at this point than Covaxin?
Well, it does appear that at least in terms of the initial supply, even from point of view of availability, the Covishield is actually going to outnumber Covaxin in terms of the initial rollout. There'll be a mix of both in terms of different centers getting different vaccines, but overwhelmingly, I think in the initial stage, you're going to see Covishield and less of Covaxin because
But,
when the production
so the
ramps up.
problem is, right now for health workers, it's fine. But let's say we shift to the phase where it is elderly people or people who are vulnerable, ordinary people who don't actually understand the medicine of either of these vaccines. And you're told कि यहाँ पे आपको COVID-19 का टीका है, आप यहाँ जाके लगवाइए. When you're in that phase where you are able to access as general population, non-medical general population or non-medical exempt essential services, frontline workers from other categories, is it incumbent upon the government to tell you that this is Covishield and not Covaxin, and is the person then entitled to say I don't want it, or vice versa?
I believe that even now, to anybody, they should be told whether this is Covishield or Covaxin. It just can't be told that this is a vaccine.
Yeah.
Then the person should have the right to say yes or no. You may not be able to offer the choice at this point in time. The person cannot say that no, I'll only take this vaccine at this center today. On the other hand, if you're not willing to take it that day, then you may say, okay, I'm opting out, and then I'll wait for 6 weeks or whatever till the other vaccine becomes available. But it is also likely that by the time the health workers are covered and some of the other essential health workers are covered, and by the time you start getting to the vulnerable age groups, the trial should be completed and we would know whether the efficacy test has been met or not.
What are your concerns at this point? The other ethical question that has arisen is about costing. And of course, the government has in fact said the vaccines will be free for all. Many people approve of this approach because otherwise there's a sense that the vaccine that is paid for is better. I mean, there could be this imagined bias that the vaccine that is paid for is better than the vaccine that is available free. But there are also others who are saying that those who can afford should pay for it. What do you think?
Well, frankly, this is what is called a public good. When you're having an epidemic, it's not just the personal protection that an individual gets.
Yeah.
If a person does not get immunized and becomes infected, that person can then disseminate the virus to 5 people, 10 people, 20 people down the road. I mean, the cycle can actually involve many more. And we know that now 80 to 90% of the infections come from 10 to 20% of the people. So if you are a super spreader and do not get vaccinated, then you are actually a threat to society. So these negative externalities mean that it is actually a public good and public financing must protect that public good. If people pay taxes properly and if you have a proper progressive tax system, then the government should actually pay for all the vaccines to everybody. But if people want to jump the queue and then go and get it somewhere else from the private market, then that's up to them. But as far as possible, anybody who needs the vaccine and wants the vaccine must be given free of cost to the government.
Should the private sector, I mean, there are those like Kiran Shaw who, for example, have argued that when the COVID tests were being done only by the government sector, the pace of the test, the efficiency of the system was much slower. She's saying that the governments can cap the price, pricing if it so needs, but the private sector must be deployed in being able to administer the vaccine. What do you think?
I believe that firstly, the criteria of essentiality of function and vulnerability of the health state must be clearly met and they must be prioritized. We cannot allow the vaccine to get into the private market at this point in time and dilute those priorities. You cannot divert the vaccine.
So you would be against the vaccine being allowed in the private sector right now?
Certainly,
you don't buy the argument that the private sector would be faster, quicker, more efficient in administering it. What are the dangers of arming the private sector also in the way that the private sector was allowed to conduct the COVID tests?
No, if the private sector is going to be providing the vaccine according to the priority lists that the government has laid out on clear-cut criteria, which are public health criteria of essentiality of function as well as vulnerability of the health state, that's fine. But if you're going to start giving to people who do not meet those criteria, who jump the queue just because they can afford it, then you are actually diverting the available vaccine supply and not meeting the public health function and objectives. So you
So
have to make
you're saying till there is actually a surplus in terms of demand supply, the private sector cannot be allowed to get in this game. Not game, but in the
absolutely,
administering of the
absolutely,
vaccine. Yes?
absolutely. First, we have to
And
meet this criteria.
and how are we doing actually on the demand supply front?
Well, I think at the moment we have two vaccines and they will be able to ramp up their supply, but we must also recognize that AstraZeneca is a vaccine that has been borrowed from the West. It is an Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that's been produced here as Covishield. So they
Yeah.
have their commitments to the international market also, and they also have
No, but they're not allowed to export this vaccine right now. The vaccines manufactured by the Serum Institute will not be allowed for export.
Sure, certainly. But at some point in time, they will. And secondly, they're also saying they expressed a desire that after giving a certain amount of supply to the government, they will also start entering into the private market in India. Therefore, you have to have the government should be able to say that these are the kind of supplies that we need for meeting these initial 300 million people. That is, the people who are both essential workers as well as the vulnerable sections of the population. After that, you can go and do what you want. So, or you raise your production faster. So it is definitely that the government must ensure that these two objective criteria are met. And in the meanwhile, if other vaccines make the grade, and there
Yeah.
are other vaccines also queuing up, your supply chain may actually expand.
I was just going to ask you that it's not as if the Indian vaccine experiment is going to end with these two vaccines. There are several others, I think five, some say more. Are you hopeful of some other vaccines emerging this year?
Well, just as you said, we have to still wait for the trials to be completed and the efficacy test to be met. But I believe, given the kind of state of art, I would expect at least two or three of those to start emerging by June.
Well, that's good news. What are your red flags right now? You know, we've started seeing reports about medical tourism, about COVID vaccines being incorporated into the larger medical tourism debate. I don't know how that works because, according to me, countries will all choose to vaccinate their own citizens first. But, you know, we're reading bizarre articles about concierge services that may provide the COVID vaccine for the wealthy. Now, if there was, you know, enough demand, and there certainly is enough demand, if there was enough supply for the demand there is, I would have no problem with this. But actually, we're nowhere near that. So are you concerned with reports that wealthier Indians, for example, have been able to fly into cities like Dubai, other parts of the Emirates, and get themselves inoculated, or they might be able to do so going forward?
Well, if they're flying abroad and getting themselves inoculated, that's entirely up to them. Obviously, they are able to meet the cost of the airfare apart from the cost of the vaccine there.
Yeah.
But whatever is available in the Indian market should not be diverted merely because of the paying capacity of somebody who wants to grab it out of turn.
Right. How are we going to avoid black marketing in this vaccine? And is
Well,
that why you're concerned that it should? I mean, there's nothing to suggest, of course, that government systems can't be corroded. Like what you're saying makes the assumption that the private sector is a more corroded system than than the public health system.
I'm not saying that. It's possible that the private sector may play by the rules. But if the private sector is given the freedom to distribute according to its own priorities, then obviously it's going for the person who is going to pay more. On
Yeah.
the other hand, if the private sector says, okay, based on the priority lists of the government, we'll also be administering the vaccine. Right now, for example, when we are talking about health workers, there are health workers in private hospitals, private institutions, and private
Yeah.
hospitals will be administering it to them. Therefore, if they're playing by the rule book, that's fine. But on the other hand, if those vaccines are given to people who can afford to purchase at a premium, then that is wrong. So that is where you must actually prevent that kind of leakage.
Yeah. What are your red flags right now? There are immunologists who have raised questions about why Bharat Biotech was even put into the distribution system right now, arguing that the government could have waited. There are others who say that it's done well on immunogenicity and safety tests, and therefore it's okay to let it in, provided the consent forms are signed. What are some of the red flags that stand out for you?
Well, this is a matter of a debate, and certainly both sides have definite arguments. In non pandemic situations, certainly I don't think anybody would have permitted a vaccine without having completed a phase 3 trial to enter the market. But in a pandemic situation where you are still now threatened with possible increase in cases because of mutants, because international travel without vaccination becomes difficult, trade and travel also have become compromised as a result.
Yeah.
And you have a huge population of about nearly 1.38 billion. Even if you want to vaccinate about 1 billion people, you still need to start at some point in time. So there could be different reasons why people are looking at giving this faster track approval based on immunogenicity. But let me bring up one more point. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just giving you the possible arguments. I'm not saying that
Sure.
this is absolutely right.
Sure.
Now, if people are immunocompromised or immunosuppressed, either because they have very low immunity because of a disease, or if they're, for example, on cancer chemotherapy, and therefore they're
Or
immunosuppressed.
any other autoimmune disorder.
Particularly where the immunity is extremely low, not so much
Sure.
that the autoimmunity is high,
Sure.
but where
Yeah.
the immunity is low. Now, the adenovirus vector, which is there in the Covishield, is
Yeah.
otherwise a very innocuous one. It will not cause any problems. But in an immunocompromised person, even the adenovirus vector could pose a problem. So on the other
Yeah.
hand, an inactivated virus will not cause that kind of a problem. So there are multiple reasons that could be adduced as to say why we have given a fast track. As I said, under ideal circumstances, yes, the phase 3 should have been completed. And purely from a scientist's point of view, I would also say that. But I
Yeah.
suppose, given the fact that you're facing multiple challenges of mutants, a large population to be vaccinated,
Sure.
it's possible that the policymakers have taken a different view.
There's a question that says that, while you're against right now allowing the vaccine into the private sector, what about using infrastructure of private hospitals to speed up vaccination? Now, actually, I think that this is the one thing India does know how to do quite efficiently, which is large scale vaccination programs, just because of so much prior experience.
I have no problem at all with the infrastructure of the private hospitals being fully utilized as long as the private sector is acting as an extension of the public sector program.
Yeah.
That is perfectly fine. That kind of a public private partnership is fine. What I'm really reluctant to accept is a completely parallel market operating for the person who pays the highest price for a vaccine.
At this moment, what would you be advising the government to focus on? There's been some suggestion that key public figures, like has happened globally, Prime Minister downwards, should lead by example in very publicly taking one of these two vaccines. We've seen Kamala Harris and Joe Biden do this in the United States because there are anti-vaxxers, because there is rumor mongering, because there's the whole controversy over which of these two vaccines is actually safer to take. The ordinary people kind of worry about the vaccine.
Absolutely. I think it's important that for public figures and people who are likely to be influencers to not only talk about it, but also show that they are taking it. And that will certainly boost confidence. So I tell people who ask me, is this going to create some sort of a change in the DNA and create mutations and things like that? I said, if that was so, or is this vaccine having a microchip implanted that people will be followed? I said, do you think if a microchip is implanted, a politician would be taking the vaccine? Certainly not.
Yeah.
So,
I think after seeing the movie Contagion, people have
yeah.
started believing that whatever you see in the movies actually comes true in real life. No one would have believed that movie. Stranger things have happened. But no, most seriously, Dr. Reddy, which vaccine would you take? You're a
Well,
doctor. You would understand if you're a health worker. If you went to get vaccinated, would you ask which one of the two it is, and which one would you take, or would either be okay at this point? You would take whatever is available.
Basically, I would have to wait for my turn. I don't think it's my turn yet right now because
Yeah,
I'm not an active health worker at the moment.
sure.
But nevertheless, I think that I would take either of them which is offered to me at this point in time. I would have been happier if Bharat Biotech had completed the phase 3 trial and then had come into play. But I think given the weight of evidence so far and the fact that it is likely to be a relatively safe vaccine, I might go in for it. Because what would be the worst case scenario for me? I mean, not that I'm saying that that's going to be the argument for everybody.
Yeah.
Uh, it is like entering the trial, which is still going on. See, after all, there are people who are in the trials who have received a vaccine without knowing whether it was effective or not.
Or
And
whether, or without knowing whether they got a placebo, or whether they were the placebo group
yeah,
for the
whether
actual
they got a
vaccine or not.
placebo or whether they got a
Right,
placebo or not.
right,
And at the end
right.
of it, if it turns out that the vaccine is ineffective, then both the groups get it. If the vaccine turns out to be effective, then the placebo group then gets it. So I would only have to think of myself as having entered in the trial. And if it turns out in March that it's ineffective, then I go in for the regular vaccine, which is effective.
Well, lots of questions as the world's largest vaccine rollout begins. We'll have you back, Dr. Reddy. It's a pleasure as always learning a lot from you. Thank you so much, and
Thank you.
stay safe and take care. Thank you, sir.
You
Thank you
too.
very much.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in a little while with a new offering from the Mojo Story. Thank you, and bye-bye.